Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the longest book I read for the last 10 years tag, which I think might have a slightly different title, but that's what this is. This tag was created by Joey from Game of Authors, and I first saw it on the channel of Robert from Barter Hordes, and I wasn't tagged by either of them, but I thought this is a nice, easy tag, and I had great intentions of doing Vlogmas, and I even took several hours of video of Snowstorm with the idea of putting together some time-lapse stuff, but that takes work to edit, so I'll use that for something eventually, but in the meantime, I'm just going to do this nice, easy tag. The idea behind this tag is just to look up the longest book that you read every year for the last 10 years. I think Joey actually wrote 2010 to 2019, but I'm going to go back to 2009. If you are on Goodreads, go to your year in review and it tells you your shortest and longest book every year. So, nice and easy. I haven't looked at them carefully, but I'm guessing that at least half of these, if not more, are going to be whatever the longest fantasy novel that I read in any given year would be, because those tend to be really long. So I'm going to guess that there will be a lot of Robin Hobb, probably, just because she's very prolific. But we'll see. Alright, so back in 2009, the longest book that I read was actually not very long. It was 432 pages, and it was The Road to Verdun by Ian Ousby. The subheading on that one is World War I's Most Momentous Battle and the Folly of Nationalism, which I don't really remember that book in particular because all of the First World War histories that I've read over the course of my life have kind of blurred into each other for the most part, aside from some really specific ones. Yeah, I am surprised that that was the longest, although I do think that that was a year... What was I reading that year? Although that was a year when I didn't track a lot of books. I'm looking at it, I only tracked 33 books that year, and I know that's the year that I moved from Calgary to Burlington, Ontario, so... although, frankly, I've read a lot of the years I've moved, so I don't know that if I just didn't track things or what. But yeah, it looks like there weren't any really long fantasy novels that year. There's a lot of mysteries and then other pieces of war nonfiction. So in 2010, the longest book that I read was, as I anticipated, was Robin Hobb's Renegade's Magic, which was 771 pages. That, I believe, is the third book in the Soldier Sunne trilogy, which I think is the one which is the series that she wrote under that pen name that I think a lot of her fans don't particularly like. I honestly don't remember that much about it. I remember bits from, I think, early in the series that were set in the barracks, but I do remember enjoying it. I feel like it's more flintlock fantasy leaning than her Realm of the Elderlings mega series is, but yeah. Alright, in 2011, the longest book that I read was A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin, so again, another long fantasy, which that one is 1,125 pages. I remember not being particularly impressed with that, even though I know I'd had it pre-ordered and everything. I think the TV series was fairly new then, so I was back on the hype train, but I feel like I didn't enjoy that as much as I expected. I'm now distracting myself scrolling through everything else I read that year, so I'm gonna try to stop myself from that. Alright, in 2012, continuing on the theme, the longest book that I read was Robin Hobb's Dragon Haven. The Rain Wild Chronicles, I think, is what that sub-series was. I really enjoyed those when I read them. I remember more of those than I remember from the Soldier Sunne trilogy. I remember enjoying that. In 2013, we have not a fantasy novel. We have Sharon K. Penman's The Sun and Splendour, which it says was 936 pages, but I know that this was one of the first books that I read as an ebook, and I remember reading it on my iPad on a work trip. We were flying out from Toronto to Vancouver, and I remember complaining to my coworker who was sitting next to me about how long this book was, because I think when I bought it and downloaded it, I didn't realize how long it was. And we were, you know, a couple of hours into this flight, and I was like, why is this not over? Why have we not gotten anywhere? That is sort of about Richard III and that whole period of English history, and I think the only reason I picked it up was because after they made that discovery of Richard III's body, I was talking to a friend of mine who said, oh, I read a book set in that era, it's called The Sun and Splendour, you should read it. And I didn't even look into it, so I went into this assuming based on that friend's taste, that this was probably like a 250-page, less sprawling kind of piece of historical fiction. But it was very long. I remember liking bits of it, but I do remember being on that flight and turning to my coworker and saying, I can't believe how long this is. So I feel like I didn't think it needed to be that long. In 2014, we're back to fantasy for the longest book, and the longest book that I read that year was N.K. Jemisin's The Kingdom of Gods. That was also a year in which I did not track very many books. And that was the year I moved to Arlington, Virginia, from Burlington. In 2015, to my surprise, in 2015, the longest book that I read was Lawrence Hill's Any Known Blood, which was 528 pages, which is not very long. Lawrence Hill is better known as the author of the Book of Negroes. As I recall, Any Known Blood was about a guy who's, he was Canadian, but his parents were Americans who were in an interracial relationship in the time of segregation, so they had moved to Canada. And then this character, as an adult in the more or less current day, goes to DC to investigate his family. He gets mugged on the first day, I remember that. And I do remember thinking it was funny because I lived in the DC area. And I'm from sort of southern Ontario. I don't remember much else of that, to be honest, though. And that was the year, in the second half of the year, we moved to Houston that year. So then 2016. 2016, the longest book that I read was George Eliot's Middlemarch, which I think I read the first or second month that I was on BookTube, because that was the year that I joined BookTube, and Rincey from Rincey Reads was doing a read-along of that, so that was why I read that. Amusingly, I did read a lot of long fantasy that year, because I did read Robin Hobb's Fool's Assassin and Fool's Quest, and Brian McClellan's the whole Powder Mage trilogy, but none of those. Those are long, but none of them are as long as Middlemarch, so that's kind of funny. Alright, let's look at 2017. In 2017, I moved again, but within Houston. I only moved about 1.5 kilometers or so. Basically within the same zip code. We're back to normal. The longest book that I read was Assassin's Fate, which is Robin Hobb again, and that book was 847 pages. And that, I think, was the first time I recorded more than 200 books in years. I'm gonna guess that was the first year I read more than 200 books since probably 2005, because like when I moved to Calgary, I didn't have the same kind of, when I lived in Toronto originally, I had such a long commute that I just read at least a book a day pretty much on my commute. But when I moved to Calgary in 2005, I didn't have a commute like that. It was like 5 kilometers, and I would walk home from work and had a really short either train or bus trip in the morning, so I didn't read that much. That's interesting. Sort of. Is it interesting? Maybe it's not that interesting. Right, 2018, which is another year when I moved. This is when I moved back to Toronto last year. The longest book that I read was, oh, surprisingly, was Craig Thompson's Blankets, which is a graphic memoir that people who love that a lot. I was, to be honest, I kind of thought of it as an ambitious failure, although I was very impressed with the art style, but people who like it do like it a lot. I think that was the first year that I started regularly listening to audiobooks, like on a regular basis as well. Last year. It's not that long ago. Alright, so this year the longest book that I read is probably the longest book that a lot of people read this year, and that is Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newburyport, which frankly I thought was too long for what it was, although I did enjoy it. But I recently read a poetry collection that was a similar kind of stream of consciousness thing in a similar style with the references and whatnot, and it was 78 pages, and I felt I got almost exactly the same kind of experience from that 78 pages as this 1,000 plus page book, so yeah, it has slightly tarnished my original impression of Ducks Newburyport, but hey. I don't think I'm going to read anything longer than that in the next month. I do actually have a long fantasy book on hold at the library, but I don't think it's over 1,000 pages, so that will be it. Alright, if you are looking for a really easy tag to do, and this is especially easy if you have been on Goodreads for more than 10 years, I strongly encourage you to give this tag a go, because it's super easy, especially people who are doing Vlogmas properly and are looking for some extra video ideas, because this is nice and easy, and I love that. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.